Lunch to our final panel of today's conference. We're going to try to sum up, I think, some of the themes that we've discussed this morning and also touch on a couple of new issues looking more at the U.S. perspective on these issues. What is the U.S. administration's strategy? What should its strategy be? What are some of the major issues the United States is likely to confront over the next couple of years when thinking about energy in Eurasia? And to discuss these themes, we have two very esteemed guests. On my left is Douglas Hengel, who's a senior fellow at the German Marshall Fund and also an adjunct faculty member at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. And before coming to GMF, Doug had a very long career in the Foreign Service, where he served as Deputy Chief of Mission in Rome and Bratislava, and among many other postings also served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Energy, Sanctions, and Commodities, so someone with a very deep experience in the energy sphere. In addition, we also have Jonathan Elkind, who's a fellow at the Center for Global Energy Policy at Columbia University. And previously, Jonathan served as the Assistant Secretary at the Office of International Affairs at the Energy Department. So two people who are both very qualified indeed to discuss the issues at hand. I'd like to start our conversation for the next hour looking at the questions we've been addressing thus far from the perspective of the Trump administration. We have a new administration in power, approaching kind of a year in Washington. They've had a chance to set some of their priorities. They've had a chance to, I think, get their bearing on what the issues are. So now that we've had a year to observe them in office, what can we say, first off, about what their strategy is in terms of energy issues? And secondly, what are the ways it differs from that of their predecessors? Maybe I'll start with Doug and then turn it over to Jonathan.
Okay, thank you. I'm very glad to be here. I'm sort of at home here at GMF and very happy to be doing this song and dance show with John Elkind, and who I've known for a long time. And we were actually seated together. We would be, if we were still in government, maybe seated together today in Paris at the IEA, which is having its ministerial, but we were members of the governing board of the IEA together a few years back. So the Trump administration strategy. So when anytime there's a change of administrations, particularly from one political party to the other, there's a lot of anxiety sometimes about what is that going to mean in terms of change of policy, particularly given sometimes the rhetoric that's happening during a presidential campaign. And I would say probably this time that anxiety level is higher than normal. But I think in terms of the issues that we've been talking about today, it's really continuity. There was continuity from going back, really, as was mentioned before, the whole post-Cold War period in terms of our approach to this part of the world, and I think that's continued now. You heard Ed Hartney from the State Department before talk about this and the things that President Trump said when he was in Europe, our support for the Three Seas Initiative, et cetera, things that Secretary Tillerson has said about pipelines and the importance we attach to Eurasian energy security. I'm told he's saying these same things in private meetings, so it's really one of continuity. And if you look at some of the people who've been appointed, Wes Mitchell, the new Assistant Secretary for European Affairs at the State Department, I mean, he understands what we're dealing with vis-a-vis Russia. In fact, he's off in Europe now, I believe, for his first trip, which includes a stop in Kiev, and I think that's an important sign about our support for what is going on there. I think it's pretty clear from other comments that were made that U.S. assistance to the region is going to continue. So I think it's pretty much the same kind of approach, the importance that we attach to Eurasian energy security.
I guess the point that I would add to that is to try to tease out a little bit the difference between the policy as it exists today and some of the uncertainties that attend to policy in the given period right now. It is absolutely true that there has been a signaling, which I personally very much welcome, of a fundamental continuity in terms of our policy toward these issues of Eurasian energy development and energy security. But one, I think, needs to acknowledge the fact that this has also been a pretty challenging time on two levels. One, it has to do with personnel. It is a good thing that at the State Department, at the Energy Department, at other cabinet agencies, One is starting to see the appointment of presidential appointees, political appointees who will operate with the authority of this administration and will provide some clarity. The reason why that is important is that otherwise it falls to career officers who, in the best spirit of those roles, be it in the Foreign Service or the Civil Service, they operate on the basis of the existing policy until the policy changes. But there is, in my observation, an inevitable tendency on the part of the career officials at the beginning of an administration to pull the punch a little bit, to kind of soften things. And I don't make that comment with the intention in particular to castigate the current administration. That's just a fact that I have observed in any event. I would assert that it is a fact. It was true at the beginning of the Obama administration, as it was true at the beginning of the George W. Bush administration, et cetera. The difference is that the current administration has been extraordinarily slow at putting its political appointees in place, and that creates ambiguity. The second ambiguity, and again, I don't wish this to be perceived other than as an analytical point, but the audience will make its own decisions about whether it is a fair analytical point. This has been a time when many elements of fundamental policy of the United States, policy that has been consistent from one party to the next, from one administration to the next, for decades, policy has been called into question. So whether one is talking about the extent of the support of the government of the United States for trade, it has been a point of ambiguity. Whether one is talking about the way in which we relate to our allies, there has been, again, substantial ambiguity. So I salute and I give credit to the career staff who are doing, in what I interpret as the most honest and direct way they can. They are advancing policy until they are instructed that policy has changed, if it changes. I welcome the things that Doug alluded to, for example, the statements by Secretary Tillerson, for the most part, about the continuity of policy. We'll get into some of the nuances as we go along.
One of the themes that candidate and then President Trump repeatedly emphasized was the fact that the United States is getting bad deals in certain parts of its foreign policy. And I think we can ask questions about a lot of the areas he's looking at, but one area that I think is interesting in light of today's discussion is energy assistance, and in particular the balance of, on the one hand, supporting partners, on the other hand, pressuring them to get their own houses in order. And so, for example, this morning we spoke about Ukraine, which is a country that both has gotten a lot of support and also has gotten a lot of pressure from Western partners saying you need to reform on your own. In your view, is the administration striking the right balance between pressure and support when looking at countries in Eurasia and the Black Sea region?
Well, I think that it is, this is where I would tend to err on err on the side of or support continuity here. I think it is very important to do both of the things that you referred to signal and to have it be deemed to be authoritative that the United States is going to continue to invest its time, its intellectual capability, its assistance dollars, et cetera, in the kinds of changes that can take place in the countries that we are talking about today. I also think that it is important, and it will become, I think, increasingly important in the year ahead, that other side of the message of the importance of self-interested reform being undertaken by the countries in this region, that must be on their agenda. If Ukraine, for example, still well more than a year from its next presidential election, starts moving inexorably into a direction of further dividing up spoils and not continuing some of the very encouraging shoots that Ukraine has been planting, growing in the last period, then that would be a real loss of opportunity and who loses in that is the people of Ukraine.
I would just add that it seems pretty clear our assistance to the region is going to continue as a priority on these issues. I would just echo what John said. In the end, these countries have to want to make the changes, and I served in both Czech Republic and Slovakia at different times and saw them, the changes that they were making very rapidly, and I find those countries very exciting because you can see almost from day to day changes going on. They wanted to join NATO, they wanted to join the European Union, and it was like full steam ahead. And so there has to be that desire in these countries. We can assist that, we can cajole, we can browbeat sometimes, but it has to come from internally, and they have to want to make the changes.
Well, I guess another area where we've seen an interesting contrast between the Trump campaign's rhetoric and the administration's actual policy is with the question of sanctions, where there's a lot of expectation, I think, in early 2017 that sanctions on Russia would be reduced, and in fact they've been increased, largely due to congressional legislation. When we look at the question of Nord Stream, which we talked about a bit in previous panels, to what extent do you see the Trump administration as having a clear policy on Nord Stream? And if so, what do you interpret that policy as being?
So I think it's quite clear, as it was expressed in the previous panel, that our concerns about Nord Stream 2 remain the same, that it's a geopolitical project, and that it will increase European dependency on Russian gas. It will also damage Ukraine, and on and on. So, I mean, we could talk about that some more, but I think that's pretty clearly the position of this administration. Again, I understand that not only has Secretary Tillerson spoke about it publicly, but he's also raised it in numerous meetings with his colleagues from Europe. And on the sanctions piece, I think it's pretty clear from the guidance that the State Department issued last week that the U.S. is not going to be sanctioning either Nord Stream 2 or Turkish Stream, based on the way that is written. But also, based on the way it's written, the door is left open. And sanctions, what a lot of people don't understand, yes, there was this legislation that had discretionary sanctions on pipelines in it, but the administration does not need that kind of authorization from the Congress in order to enact sanctions. The president has very broad powers. Anytime he thinks that there is a national emergency, name your country, he can declare this national emergency there, and that we are going to enact sanctions on individuals or whatever. It's really quite broad power. In the case of Ukraine, there's already existing executive orders under which the president could decide tomorrow that, yes, Nord Stream 2 is a threat and enact some sanctions on it. So the fact that there was this legislation out there was a little bit of a nudge from the Congress. And it looks like, for the moment at least, the administration is not going to go down that path, which is not surprising given all the concerns raised about it in Europe. But it's still, the potential is there that could be reviewed at some point. Should, I think, something, the Russians increase their bad behavior in Ukraine, for example.
Jonathan, could I turn the question a little bit to you? If the administration's policy is that Nord Stream is a bad idea and they're not willing to go down the sanctions route, at least right now, are they likely to succeed in stopping Nord Stream from being built, or do they need some sort of new policy in order to actually achieve their goal on Nord Stream?
Well, this is an area where I think a great deal of nuance is called for, because it's, in my opinion, in the nature of Nord Stream 2 that you can simultaneously have something that is very much of interest to the European companies that are wishing to invest in the project, certainly very much of interest to the Russian state and to Gazprom that are wishing to protect market share in a European natural gas market that is not growing by leaps and bounds, to say the least. And indeed, a project that, according to the findings of the legal service of the European Commission, does not at present appear to be crosswise of that, yet it still is extremely hard to understand how the many times enunciated objectives of diversification that have come from the European Commission are consistent with this project. Now, I think it is really important to stress that it's not the passport of the molecules of gas that makes this bad. It's that there are a number of well-established business models that have been employed in the European marketplace in the past that create questions around whether, at the end of the day, the fundamental motivation is commercial or political. Personally, I find it to be revealing that the treatment of individual off-takers of gas has been differentiated by the political views of country X, whichever that off-taker may be, towards certain elements of Russian policy. And so I find it very difficult to deny the political element of this picture. Now, having said all of that, do I think that the use of sanctions or the threat of sanctions is the way to achieve the outcome that has been the rather long-standing objective of U.S. administrations? I doubt it. I really seriously doubt it, because I think that this is a case in which Europe needs to decide whether building another piece of infrastructure that ultimately will be paid for by consumers in Europe, that cannot be least cost or close to it, and that simply as a matter of technical reality will have the effect of putting in one channel 80% of the imports that come from Russia. So this is, again, lots of nuances called for here. I firmly believe that saber-rattling toward our European partners will not be productive here. They have to, in this, decide their own future. We have a huge stake in it, but at the end of the day, it's their decision.
If I could just add there, I mean, maybe not saber-rattling, but I think getting our points across clearly. And, in my experience, the countries of Central and Eastern Europe have felt kind of disadvantaged vis-a-vis, Germany and the others, and that it was very helpful to them to have us weighing in with Brussels and the other countries when the Central and Eastern Europeans did not feel like their voice was being heard. So I think that's helpful. I wanted to underline this point too about the energy union in part was formed because of concerns about excessive dependence on one source. And in fact, you had, part of the inspiration here was then Prime Minister Tusk talking about, combining forces to negotiate with Russia. And so now we have a situation, where Nord Stream 2, which seems to be completely contrary to the idea of an energy union and solidarity, this famous solidarity principle. So, it raises all the concerns you raise, and I think, even more.
If I could just jump back in for 1 second. One of the difficulties, I think, about this particular set of issues is that the energy union is not an established thing right now. And in a time when the politics of Europe are awfully complicated and the availability of time and intellectual bandwidth of the leadership, the collective leadership of Europe, is really overtaxed with, Brexit, Grexit, whoever else, Ixit, Catalexit, is that what the next one is? And huge challenges of migration and macroeconomic issues, and the aspiration to create an energy union. On a good day, that's an overload. And these are really, so I don't mean any of my last comment to be understood as anything other than the challenge that is in front of Europe. And by the way, from time to time, the response that I hear from Russian counterparts is, will the Europeans please make up their minds what they want their marketplace to be, and then we can get on with it. Now, sometimes I think that is a very genuine statement. Sometimes I think that's a slightly theatrical statement. But it is a fact that the marketplace in Europe for the network energy industries is changing. It's in the process of changing. And those relationships, including between and among different member states, where the prerogative sits and who makes decisions, it's not well established, and that is an additional challenging factor in this picture.
One of the new factors in the Nord Stream debate since the Trump administration came to power is the question of U.S. LNG exports. And so you've had not only in the congressional legislation, but also a number of senior administration officials directly linking Nord Stream 2 to LNG exports, saying that if you don't have Nord Stream 2, then you can have the opportunity of importing LNG from the United States. Doug, do you want to maybe comment on to what extent this is A, a reality, and then B, how this shapes the debate within Europe?
Yeah. So in the interest of full transparency, one of the hats I wear in my post-State Department life is with a trade organization that represents some of the U.S. LNG exporters. So I'm not here today representing them, but I am involved in that. I think it's unfortunate that that issue has gotten tangled up in Nord Stream 2. I mean, we've been concerned about and supportive of European energy, Eurasian energy security for many, many years, long before anyone, had a dream that we might be exporting our own molecules of gas to Europe. I mean, when we talk about U.S.-EU energy cooperation, it goes back much further than the Cold War. It goes back to, at least the time when we formed the International Energy Agency together along with Japan after the Arab oil embargo. I mean, we've been very involved, very united with Europe in terms of trying to address energy security issues. Now we have the added advantage that we can export natural gas, but the concerns the U.S. government has raised about Nord Stream 2 have nothing to do with that's a bogus argument that it's commercial diplomacy to try to sell our gas. Now Mamuka has left the room. I wanted to comment on that, the importance of natural gas. Well, he mentioned the Trans-Caspian pipeline earlier. And I've always been a little puzzled about this attraction the Europeans have for getting gas from the most exotic locations by the most sort of improbable means. So 7 or 8 years ago, they were talking all the time about a trans-Saharan pipeline to bring natural gas from Nigeria up to Europe. There was talk about a gas pipeline from Qatar across Saudi Arabia, across Syria, right through the middle of Syria, and onto Turkey and beyond. Trans-Caspian pipeline, I mean, I understand there was a group actually out there, including U.S. government officials in Turkmenistan last week, and the Turkmen didn't want to meet with them in the end. So, I mean, I just don't think that kind of thing is gonna go anywhere, and I don't understand the attraction of, in this case, it would be a pipeline going with several thousand kilometers to get to markets in Europe. There is a lot of underutilized LNG regasification capacity in Europe now, and with plans to build more terminals. If the one in Kirk Island is built, getting that gas from there to Hungary is a very short distance, also to Ukraine. I mean, these countries are now, the networks are much more interconnected. It's easy to bring in LNG at various points in Europe and have it go virtually anywhere. You can do swaps. So I think there should be more attention, whether it's U.S. gas or somebody else's gas, to look at those issues as opposed to these ideas, these incredibly long, complicated pipelines from, not the most stable places in the world. Now you have, a lot of gas. There's a oversupply in the market now, gas from the United States, Australia, fairly secure places. I think more attention in Europe should be given to, and that's ready now to go and have an impact on markets. So anyway, now I'll calm down.
Well, for my money, I would say a couple of things. First of all, I just cards on the table. I'm not a fan of the energy dominance idea. It may make for great base politics, but it is. I have never encountered a counterpart of the United States government that wishes to be dominated. Our counterparts that are potential buyers of U.S. LNG or anything else in the energy sector are looking for our partnership, they're looking for our engagement, they're looking for consistency of our presence and our efforts to work with them. They're not looking for dominance. Second point, I think it is an extremely unfortunate thing to link the decisions that need to be made by Europe in a self-interested way about its energy security going forward and our second and very separate interests to encourage the export of goods and services from the United States. These are two important matters in which the United States is not disinterested. If you paste them to each other, they each are in a less advantageous position. So I think that is very important. Can U.S. LNG make a difference in the European market? Yes, demonstrably it already has done so. And so people are well aware of the experience that came into being even before the Klaipeda regasification capability was commissioned, wherein it led to a significant reduction. I think the number is 20% reduction in the price that Gazprom was otherwise charging Lithuania. Similarly, there will be other choices that will be made, whether one is talking about Świnoujście or Kirk or other places around Europe. The fact that there is a lot of underutilized regas capacity in Europe should be understood as something we must understand that as an expression of the condition of the European market in all of its pieces, parts. One, that means that there is a lot of competitively priced Russian gas in that marketplace. Two, it means that there is an absence of interconnection in some of the critical places where it needs to exist in order for there to be really a single natural gas market. You cannot move, serious volumes of gas out of the Iberian Peninsula into the rest of continental Europe. You can't move gas between and among the Central European states at present with any kind of fluidity that would allow for arbitrage opportunities to drive the availability of additional volumes of gas at times when it is needed. So the U.S. LNG already is having an impact. I expect that probably it won't be huge volumes that will flow from the United States as LNG into the European market. Knowing that the gas is available, however, is a critically important piece. And opportunistically, buyers, in what will be a buyer's market, what is a buyer's market today and will remain so probably until somewhere into the 2020s, that's a nice place to be if you're a European buyer because you've got choices. And that fundamentally is something that is helped in a very, very fundamental way by the developments of U.S. LNG in the last several years.
Let me just add on the competition piece here is very important. You mentioned this. I mean, Russia, Gazprom has had to react to the new reality, and they're even doing things like auctioning off additional quantities of gas, and Europe has done a lot in terms of creating a level playing field for different kinds of gas to compete there. In that regard, there is no one's talked today about the antitrust case against Gazprom, which I believe is still not finally resolved. But that's also a critical piece here because what we've been concerned about is that molecules from Gazprom come along with a political agenda, And if that can really be eliminated, and it's part the infrastructure, it's part the hardware, it's part the software, the competition rules, if they have to, abide by all of that, I mean, I wouldn't say the problem's quite solved, but it's well on its way to being resolved, I think.
That gets back to our first panel today about the importance of the logistics, interconnectors and things like that within Europe. One more question from my end, and then we'll open up to the audience. On the question of diversification, we've talked about Nord Stream 2, which is billed as a diversification effort away from Ukraine towards a more stable supply route. That's the Russian argument. We've talked about US LNG as one factor that could help diversify. One of the challenges that the EU has is that a lot of the places that they might try to get more gas from are places that are not only unstable, but also undemocratic. So we can look at Turkmenistan as an obvious example. Azerbaijan is a place that has had serious backsliding over the past couple of years. Do you see a change in how the Trump administration is approaching the balance between supporting democratization and getting access to energy? And I ask that in light of, I think, what's been a noticeable, a rhetorical shift in the administration side, but is that actually reflected in policy towards diversification in Europe?
I'm not sure quite how to answer that, except to say, having been a career diplomat, we are able to sort of walk and chew gum at the same time. So, if we look at certain countries, there's a variety of issues, right? Usually that's not just one issue with a country. There might, we might have business, economic interests, and there also might be some human rights challenges, democracy issues, et cetera, counter narcotics in some places. And we can deal with all of those at the same time. I mean, here, I'm thinking China is an example of a country where we've had, for some years now, some major differences on a number of issues, but in the energy area, some amazingly good cooperation with them on the energy and climate agenda. So the same thing can happen. I mean, it's no secret there are some relations with Azerbaijan. There are some issues where we're in full agreement and some where we're in less fulsome agreement. And, we were able to deal with those and, try to advance the agenda in a positive way. So it's a very kind of diplomatic dancing around answer, but we are able to deal with, one doesn't necessarily affect the other.
Jonathan, do you see a shift since the Obama administration?
No, I think that there's been less, I don't perceive a shift in terms of, for example, dealing with Azerbaijan. I see it, the concern that I expressed earlier on in this discussion was whether there's been a shift in the dealing with Germany and France and Italy, et cetera. So I completely support Doug's response there. I was never a career diplomat, and I think you're giving yourself too little credit. I mean, I think, look, this is a case where my nuance point from earlier does apply. That I think it's incumbent on us, if we wish to have an engagement for a reputation with these countries for serious engagement and sustained engagement, then we have to actually do that. We have to be able to be supportive of the host country's policies in one area, and in a constructive way, in a clear way, also, critical as the circumstances merit. Our counterparts do the same thing, right? So that's just part of the deal.
Great, we'll have some time for questions. Jonathan?
I do have just a comment on that, on human rights and these other issues quickly. I mean, my sense is that countries in the region, particularly those that we work with on energy reforms like Ukraine, maybe get a sense that this administration is not as forceful on pushing on reforms in the way that the previous administration, basically you had Vice President Biden pushing for key reforms, and maybe where you don't have the same focus of attention at the White House. So I think that's a challenge, and I think the lack of the use of the word human rights, democracy, and governance, when it comes to U.S. engagement, having the highest level of the U.S. administration actually use that terminology is really important. And I agree with you, too. It seems to me that career diplomats and others who are working on these issues know how to balance these challenging issues, and I saw that up close. But my question really was more about the about Russia sanctions and sort of future casts, because I think the reaction of Congress to what to this last round of sanctions was partially based on the disinformation campaign, what happened during the elections. And I think we're, even our European colleagues should be kidding themselves if they don't think that Congress isn't going to react strongly. This is no longer, Russia's no longer an international issue for Americans. It's very domestic. And so there are ongoing investigations, both in Congress and externally, the Mueller investigation, that are likely to keep, I'm not casting judgment one way or the other on whether someone is guilty after being indicted or not, but it looks like it's rolling in a direction that shows some type of direct connection to what took place during the election, things that we already know. So I think there's likely to be another round of reactions from Congress again. And I heard what you said in relation to the energy sector sanctions, and I think there was a lot of work that was done to try to ultimately minimize the impact, particularly on European partners. But the question I would have is, one, if you wanted to address challenges coming from Russia, I think it's very likely that the energy sector will be looked at again, and maybe the exceptions or the ability for the administration to hold back on those sanctions won't exist. But I'm just trying to get a sense from you what you think it might look like if you were to look at the Russia energy sector, and if you think that they're the main cause or the main funder of disinformation, or many of the disinformation campaigns, which some claim that they are, how would you address that challenge with that sector? Because I do think that we haven't seen the end of sanctions being used in this context. I think there will be a reaction when we move down and the Mueller investigation concludes. I think there's going to be a very strong reaction from Congress. I'm not sure how the administration is going to react, because that's unknown, but I wanted to get a sense from you what that might look like, and how do we avoid impacting our allies in this process who maybe don't understand where this deep-seated push from in Washington is coming from to address these challenges.
I think the Europeans understand, because they were subject to some of the same efforts at manipulation. The sanctions legislation that was signed into law this past summer is broader than just energy, and it's, the Russian piece of it has several parts that are still in the process of being sort of decided upon or implemented. There was the list of companies involved in the defense and intelligence spheres, and if I recall correctly, then the next step is to decide what we're going to do with that list of companies. So there could be some sanctions appearing in that space. Another part of that legislation was a list of oligarchs, many of whom are already under various sanctions. So that's another piece that I think had to be sent to the Congress within 180 days of the legislation. So there are other things coming down the pike that could result in additional sanctions. I mean, obviously, energy is an area of attention here. It's an area where they do get a lot of their income from. There's always a balance that has to be struck here between, what we do vis-a-vis another country and what we might be doing to hurt ourselves or our allies. Iran is a good example. It was when there was a huge increase in U.S. oil production that allowed us to go to allies and say, okay, we want to up the pressure on Iran. We have a lot of oil coming onto the market, so it's not, some Iranian oil can go off the market and you won't suffer from it. I mean, that kind of argumentation. Otherwise, it becomes, a tough, a difficult thing. Europe depends on Russia for a lot of gas. Yes, there are alternatives out there, so it has to be a discussion. We have to have the Europeans on board, I guess, is what I'm saying here, or this isn't going to work. I worry, as a sanctions geek, kind of that we overuse sanctions. The previous Treasury Secretary gave an important speech about on this, a couple of years back. there are risks to overusing sanctions, particularly when we don't have other countries lined up with us. So I think, we have to weigh various things there that, various factors.
Jonathan, do you also want to comment in particular on the link between the Russian energy sector and the disinformation that Jonathan pointed out? Is it right to see the energy sector is more involved than other sectors in Russia?
So I understood, maybe I misunderstood your point as saying that Russia was the source of the disinformation. I didn't understand that you were saying.
It's the energy sector money is funding disinformation.
But look,
Because of its prominence within Russia.
yeah, I mean, the oil sector in particular, the gas sector to a lesser extent, is a source of the lion's share, historically anyway, of Russia's central government revenues. That point has been well documented by Thane Gustafson and others. Interestingly, with the drop in prices in the last couple of years, if you look at the numbers from 2016, the share of oil and gas in the Russian government revenues is way down. That's an expression of what's happening in the marketplace. It's not a signal of healthy diversification necessarily in the Russian economy. So if it is true that the lion's share of the revenues are coming from oil in the first instance, gas to a much lesser extent, and if, as the intelligence community has suggested, the government of the Russian Federation has been involved in some serious monkey business in our elections, yes, there is a tether that is there, but I don't think it could be said that these are decisions that were made by actors in the energy sector. And so there's a little bit of a leap that I'm not willing to make there. I think it's important, and Jonathan, I take your point that you about the significantly reduced emphasis on the part of those in the White House to democracy, human rights, and political evolution in many different parts of the world. And I think that is a fair comment. I think also, though, in fairness, again, in the other way, when I was on the National Security Council staff under the Clinton administration, there was a broad perception on the part of people who did not like the energy focus that we were developing at that time. There was a perception that we were giving too much sway to energy and too much to security affairs and too little to democracy and human rights, et cetera. So I accept your point, but I also think that getting and keeping that balance right from one year to the next is a non-trivial thing, and I don't claim that the administrations that I have worked for have, gotten it 100% spot on. I won't say that. In terms of the sanctions and the idea that this now is a matter of domestic politics, I believe that is absolutely accurate. And not to put too fine a point in it, but I think that you could say that the sanctions bill that went to the president for signature was an expression of some degree of discomfort or distrust from the members of the U.S. Congress toward the administration about whether it would be robust enough in protecting U.S. interests against the backdrop of what has been said about our last election. And that suggests that there is a political X factor that enters into any discussions about sanctions. I don't say that with any glee or happiness, because I think that Doug is right to point out that when it comes to economic sanctions, we've got that classic Washington hammer in your hand, everything looks like a nail problem, and we are at risk to ourselves of overuse of the sanctions tool.
We have time for a couple more questions. Sir?
Thank you. Jayhun from Azerbaijan, research at George Washington University. We were talking about the LNG from the U.S. To EU and to provide the energy to lessen the energy dependence of the European Union from Russia. But maybe if sitting here in D.C., I think in Washington, maybe United States is taking it for granted that European Union also tries to be not much dependent on the U.S. And that's why they are also trying to balance it between the U.S. and Russia. And by that, they are trying to somehow build kind of, like pipelines from Russia so that they cannot be 100% dependent on the U.S. in political as well. So maybe that can also be taken into account. And because, and also maybe European Union is indeed, likes it when there is some political agenda from along with the natural gas molecules from Russia when it comes to Europe, when they like it, like just to exaggerate the things and to make it to make US to always have attention on the European security. US and EU relations is not the same as it was in 50s and 60s, and there are countries in Europe that they are trying to outbalance US interests in Europe. So that's why maybe they are trying to do that with the hand of by doing the relationship with Russia on energy security is fair. It was just a comment on that, and also another comment on the human rights and energy, human rights and democracy. It was mentioned that there is no any relationship between energy pipelines and human rights and democracy. But what if some sanctions are applied to, to the economic sanctions, and then the construction of those pipelines will be put on hold because they will not have money to do that, and then they will have to be forced to do some political reforms. So from that point of view, I can see some relations. I mean, and the last point is on the comment regarding that US has not been able to be 100% spot on in balancing this energy and security and then military affairs with the democracy and human rights. I think that's very decent and very modest way of saying that, because for me, the United States 100% failed to do that. It's not spot on, but failed to do that, which is unfortunate. And now we are seeing the backlash on that sphere. So, but these are just the comments. You can comment on my comments if you will. But my question is about the LNG again, that the LNG, maybe I personally don't know, so that's why I'm asking, do you see any relationship between the reduced US interests in the Eurasia? Because US is now capable of exporting LNG to Europe, so that's why there is some, shifting balance and shifting interests from Eurasia now, because the US is also self-sufficient, and not only self-sufficient, but exported to EU. So do you see that there too, like the relations? Thank you.
So if I can extract maybe two questions from that and put it to our panelists. One is on US-EU conflict and cooperation and the extent to which we're seeing shifts in that balance about disagreements versus working together on energy. And the second thing is on the US role in Eurasia, and maybe in particular Central Asia. Is there a withdrawing of interest just because energy is being focused elsewhere and we're focusing less on Trans-Caspian or Turkmen gas?
I'll start. I mean, two rather short replies. Look, there's lots of complexity in the relations between the United States and various European partners. And it's not a surprise that there is a diversity of views in Europe, as there is a diversity of views in the United States about whether to engage at all with parties outside of our borders, for example. There's an alive and well thread in American politics that only goes back for the last 250 years, about whether we should even bother with foreign entanglements, to use the standard terminology. And likewise, there are people who are in Europe trying to engage in business dealings with Russia and to play off of the tensions between the United States and Russia. But to me, it's a highly unsurprising dynamic, and I think it should not be for a moment confused with the fundamental strength of the North Atlantic relationship. Now, it is I said earlier in some fairly critical comments about some of the decisions that have been made by this administration that failing to sustain relationships with allies, the countries whose support we need and rely on when push comes to shove, that is a fundamental risk that I would not personally wish to see us taking. Even that does not contradict, I would say, that today there is a real commonality of interests across the North Atlantic. We ought to make sure that we preserve it and enhance it. Second, the U.S. withdrawal. Look, there are lots of questions about the ways in which, lots of questions that I hear, both when I was in government service and since that time, about whether the changed fortune of the United States when it comes to oil and gas production will rewrite our security relationships around the globe. Short answer, no. We are dependent on global markets today as we were yesterday. How much of the consumption in the United States, in particular of oil, comes from production inside the United States is a separate question. But if there were a disruption in, you name it, Venezuela, Libya, Nigeria, wherever, Kurdistan, those disruptions affect the global market. And oh, by the way, in a situation where crude oil exports from the United States are permitted, we would see that expressed in our pump prices. Refined products always have been okay for export from the United States, so it doesn't even take the crude oil exports to mean that we are part of a global marketplace. So we have a stake in what happens in the Strait of Hormuz and the Strait of Malacca and the Horn of Africa and a bunch of other challenging places around the globe. And so I do not expect anytime soon to see a fundamental rewriting of those investments by the United States in the long-term security, freedom of navigation, and so forth.
U.S.-European relations have had their ups and downs over the years. I mean, you don't have to think back very long. The Iraq War, there was some real tensions. You go back further when we were putting short-range nuclear missiles into Europe. I mean, there's been, we had very good times and some not so good times. So I agree completely with John. The long-term interests are such that whatever current issues there might be, there'll be other issues down the road. On Central Asia, the United States played, I think, a pretty important role in trying to help those countries, including Azerbaijan, become truly independent of Russia back in the day. I mean, I think it's a matter of geography that, China and Russia are going to be the main actors in that part of the world. Secretary Kerry did take a trip to the region when he was Secretary of State. I think it's too soon to say what the new administration will do in that part of the world. Having worked on Latin America during my career, we're always hearing, where's the love? Where's the love? The United States doesn't care about us. So there's only so many hours in the day. But you mentioned this LNG and whether Europe would really be interested in it. When there was a debate going on here a few years ago about whether we would be able to export gas, there was a real debate. There was a lot of industrial interests that wanted to keep it all here, so we'd have really cheap energy for their chemicals and whatever. There was a number of European countries that started this organization that I'm part of now that to impact the debate to allow our gas to be exported because they understood that this would be important for helping them achieve energy security. Whether they ended up buying any of that gas or not, it meant that there were options. And so I think there's still that desire. And I would just echo John's comment too about, a lot of people wondering whether our energy abundance, or now dominance, will change our view of the world. But our interests are such that I don't think it's going to have an important impact. So I agree with him on that. It's a global energy, global oil market. Maybe we're coming to the point where it becomes a global gas market. But we have a lot of interests in other parts of the world that that aren't directly related to energy.
Mamuka?
Thank you for discussion and interesting points. What do you think about German position on this, on the natural gas issue and import issue? If you are German, let's put yourself in a moment in the shoes of German strategists, politicians, people who look at future of Germany. Wouldn't it be obvious to have this in the interest of Germany, to have as many pipelines coming directly to German territory as possible? And if that's the case, so then what should our sort of strategy vis-a-vis that should be?
Should we get one more question? Do you have a question? No? Sir?
Thank you for the excellent discussion on the energy-related issues. I'm Vugar from Embassy of Azerbaijan. I wanted to make a small comment on Mr. Hengel's point about the big pipelines which come from the unstable regions. I mean, in case of Southern Gas Corridor, I mean, this goes through the several U.S. allies and partners, and many U.S. companies, service companies benefited from this pipeline, including from Baku to the Ceyhan, Erzurum. I think from this perspective, the Southern Gas Corridor is an alternative, and there was a discussion between political dependence and obviously nobody will be depending on Azerbaijani gas, which is a good thing, but it will be a really good source of diversification. My question is on more technical pricing issue. Now we have prospects of LNG, we have Nord Stream 2, we have Turkish Stream, we have Southern Gas Corridor. I mean, all this in perspective. What do you think in terms of pricing? Which supplier will be in a better position, to play with the prices? And which source will be more competitive vis-a-vis others? Thank you.
Let's grab one final question, and then I'll turn it back to both of you to wrap up. Sir?
Thanks a lot, Muzilov, Embassy of Ukraine. So that's absolutely clear that the US is seeking for transatlantic unity regarding energy sanctions. So it's absolutely clear position, and we all agree with that. But at the same time, as Mamuka mentioned, so if you are sitting in the place of German politicians, so everything looks absolutely different. So, because we know very well, I mean, Ukrainians, that frankly speaking, freedom is not free. So it's not about business, it's not about profits, it's about dependence on Russia and dependence on their energy resources. And if you're increasing that dependence, one day, one moment, they will use it. So maybe it should be, and actually that's their strategy, like to divide European nations regarding these questions. So I guess it will be extremely difficult to find some kind of European Union unity to impose some kind of restrictions against Nord Stream 2. So that's why I think, and that's the question, maybe it should be some kind of American leadership in that question, just like with previous sanctions, to impose, first of all, US sanctions against Russian energy pipelines, and after that, Europeans will make the same step. Thank you.
Okay, let's do one final question, then we'll wrap up.
You waiting to get one you like?
An easy one for you.
Thanks for giving me the chance. I have a question about Iran's role in world energy market. You know, after 5+1 agreement with Iran over Iran nuclear program, Iran is planning to increase its shares in especially natural gas. Iran is planning by 2015 to increase its share from to 10%, and also it's planning to increase oil production capacity by during a decade ago. A decade after that to 5 million barrel per day. But I think at present Iran has a problem to attract foreign investment and foreign technology due to current Trump administration sanction to Iran energy sector. I want to just know what's challenge toward Iran such program. Is it possible to Iran to access such aims or not?
Great, so we have German strategy, dependence on Russia and US leadership, the Southern Gas Corridor and pricing, and then Iran.
You started it, Mamuka. So no. So look, the German view on multiple pipelines. Funny thing about multiple pipelines, those of you in the room, and I know there are several of you who have this long memory, will recall the bumper sticker in the 1990s, "Happiness is multiple pipelines." The interesting thing is that is a home truth that seems to have been understood by many parties, including Russia, I would point out. However, having said that, I wouldn't say that Germany's interests are coincident with any particular project. And here I will say what I know is well known to you already, Mamuka, which is that there are different perspectives on this issue from different parties within Germany. There are some who feel a very strong sense of loyalty to certain industrial interests in Germany. That happens in lots of different countries. There are others who look with a greater sense of question about whether Germany's interests in a functioning European Union are best advanced by a move that will, yes, have some short-term benefits for Germany, but some long-term challenges for Germany as part of a broader Europe. In terms of suppliers and prices for natural gas, I mean, one of the very good things about the development of LNG from the United States, from Qatar, from Australia, et cetera, is that the European marketplace now has competition in it. And so nobody is in a position in the aggregate to manipulate price, in the aggregate. Now, the question of whether that proves true in individual cases, individual member states across the European Union, will be a reflection of the success or failure at actually materializing something that they are referring to as the energy union. So if you have interconnection and you end up with a particular party cutting off supply, then that competitive marketplace brings you alternative supply on a beneficial price so that everybody ends up being a price taker rather than a price maker. And I've forgotten whose question that was, actually. Anyway, to our colleague from the Ukrainian embassy, look, I will be slightly bold in the phraseology here. The best Ukrainian defense against Nord Stream 2 is seriousness on energy reform, even in the face of the political titans that are fighting over decision-making in the Ukrainian energy sector today. And last, on Iran and its stated interest to increase natural gas and oil production. Iran has stated those interests and has elicited from some international partners some material interest in investment. I struggle with the uncertainties that are created by the administration around the JCPOA, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, whose purpose always was to take care first of the biggest problem on the block, which was the development of a nuclear weapons capability by Iran. The presence of the JCPOA does not obstruct Iran's ability to develop natural gas and oil deposits. I don't think that that is an indication of a shortcoming of the JCPOA, however. I think it represents a pragmatic effort that was made by the previous administration to deal with the big problem first, and then to open the possibility that one could deal with the other problems, which are not trivial, in due course.
I'll go in reverse order. So it seems like every week there's a statement from some Iranian leader about their plans for sending hydrocarbon resources all over the world, production, et cetera. Leaving the sanctions issue aside, they need to have well, even more so with remaining sanctions in place, they need to have a very competitive system for developing the resources within country, very good conditions. Right now, companies have been cutting back over the last several years on upstream, oil and gas work because of the oil price, et cetera. And there's a lot of competition for the dollars out there in Africa and Latin America and elsewhere. So Iran has to have a very competitive system, which doesn't seem to be the case at the moment if they want to attract the investment from outside that they're going to need. Leaving aside the sanctions issues complicate that. On Ukraine, I would just echo your comments about reform, but also Ukraine has, as I understand it, pretty significant potential for at least gas, both onshore and offshore. And I don't know what's going on there now, but if the conditions are attractive, I think you would get some companies coming in, and I think that's important longer term. On terms of the pricing on gas, there are increasingly it's hub-based in Europe, so it's going to be very competitive. I mean, people say that Gazprom can always undercut because they have the cheapest costs of production. I don't know. We'll see what the market does, but they have to compete. That's the important thing now. They have to compete. And on Germany, what to do if I understood the question? If Nord Stream 2 goes forward? That just underlines the importance of the rules in Europe being strictly enforced. So if that additional gas does come in, it can go wherever without Gazprom having any influence on that. The third energy package has to be enforced. And so I return to the point that I'm really interested in how the anti-competition case against Gazprom will come out, if they will really have to comply strictly or maybe even beyond that with all of the rules in Europe, so you remove that issue from the table, hopefully.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground, not only this morning, but in our last set of questions. So I'd like to wrap up by thanking Jonathan, Maya, and Mamuka for putting on this excellent event today. And please join me in thanking our panelists for an excellent wrap-up discussion. Jonathan?
I just add one word. I just want to join in and thank everybody, and also a lot of my colleagues from GMF spent a lot of time today, last week, getting set up for this on a Monday morning. So really the unsung heroes of this event are colleagues at GMF who really helped pull this together. And it was great to work with FPRI and also work with others to put this together. And I really just want to thank Mamuka as well, and thank you for your support, and also bringing some of your colleagues in from your institute together to be here today. So I think together we combined to put together, I think, a good program, and hopefully one that we'll continue to build on in the future. Thank you.